Leon Pinco and Jaburi Gazul. And since Leon Pinco was actually one of my graduate students, if I may get personal for a moment, I'm pleased to say that she is my first academic grandchild. I got academically married late in life. It's a particular moment of pride for me. Zuzana is a tropical biologist and conservation scientist, and she's worked on a wide range of issues in recent years. They include the impacts of selective logging on biodiversity in the tropics. She's involved in a project, a large project in Papua New Guinea using sound recordings. Sound recordings of the wild, essentially, to measure the effects of human disturbance on natural communities. Hopefully, using sound as an effective and relatively efficient way to gather what would otherwise be very hard to gather data. She's been working with me on the wild bird trade, focusing on the sociological side of that issue, what motivates people to own captive reared versus wild-caught birds, a topic of significant conservation importance. And she will be starting in the new calendar year a major project with Rhett Butler of mangabay.com, a study of which conservation interventions, which approaches have proven successful at safeguarding biodiversity. What I think connects all of these disparate areas of research is her ability to generate incisive syntheses of lots of data in order to discern broad patterns of how species and natural communities respond to different sorts of human activities, including land use change. And she does it with a great deal of rigor as well. So it's a pleasure to welcome her today, and she's going to be talking about really another side of the work she's doing that focuses on conservation in the tropics. So it's a real pleasure to welcome Zuzana Burivalova.
Thank you, David, for the wonderful introduction, and thank you for coming to today's talk. When I was a PhD student and I was visiting Princeton and my academic grandfather, I came to a few of these STEP seminars, and I was actually really impressed by the interdisciplinarity, because that's something that's important to me. So it's a great privilege to be back here at Princeton, work here, and present at the STEP seminar. And talk about my favorite topic, which is tropical forests and forestry. This is the Brooklyn Bridge. You've probably walked across the pedestrian triangle in the middle, which is made out of wood. And for the last 135 years, it has been made of tropical hardwood, which was very unsustainably sourced from Latin America. And so it's a safety regulation that every 35 years, all the planks across this Brooklyn Bridge promenade in the middle have to be replaced. And the next time it's going to happen will be next year, in 2017. And so a group of architects and sustainability scientists and enthusiasts decided that this is a great opportunity, and they proposed to the city to, from now on, always, that is every 35 years, which roughly corresponds to one logging cycle in the tropics, always source the wood for the Brooklyn Bridge promenade from one particular forest in Washington in Guatemala. This forest is a community-managed forest. It also has Forest Stewardship Council certification. So this project would be effectively coupling New York City and Brooklyn Bridge to this one very particular community in Guatemala. And so if this goes through and this is accepted, this would be great news not only for the people from Washington and the forest, but it will be also a great advert for the Forest Stewardship Council, and it will probably increase people's awareness about what community forest management is. And so I want to ask, what does this really mean? Is certification a good idea? Is community forest management a good idea? What are the real on-the-ground impacts of these two conservation schemes? And this is important far, far beyond the Brooklyn Bridge. The global forestry trade is worth as much as the global fisheries. It's a huge industry, and in the tropics it's even increasing. And wood is coming back as a major construction material, believe it or not, but there are 20-story buildings being made entirely out of timber these days, in the so-called mass timber and tall wood movement. So it is now that we really have to reassess how the timber for all these projects is sourced from tropics. So during the talk, I'll first of all briefly introduce both schemes, certification and community forest management. Then I will briefly talk about all the difficulties we have to face when we're evaluating the real impact of conservation. And then I'll present the actual evidence that we have. And I will finish up with some recommendations which will hopefully inspire a debate. So throughout the talk, I'll be talking about these 5 main forest uses. I'll be comparing certified industrial forest management with conventional industrial forest management. I'll be comparing community forest management with no management, which I'm calling open access. And then there is a hybrid approach, like the forest in Washington, a community managed forest that is also certified. And these 5 forest uses, that's pretty much it. Beyond protected areas, this is it. That's the major tropical forest uses we have. So, certification in the tropics and community forest management, they have a shared history. After the Second World War, selective logging in the tropics became mechanized. With chainsaws, it became much easier and much faster, like 20 times faster to log a tree. With bulldozers, it became much easier to haul the trees out, build roads, transport them to the ports. And this unleashed a huge, large-scale degradation of the tropical forests. And now it's important, I want to make sure that we distinguish between degradation of tropical forests and deforestation. What logging in the tropics does is degradation. During tropical logging, we only log trees selectively. We pick a few trees from every hectare. We don't do clear cutting like you may have seen in North America or in Europe. And the reason for this is in the tropics, in every single hectare or patch of forest, there's hundreds of tree species. And not all of them, in fact, only very few are of commercial interest. So nobody is really interested in clear cutting. And so the idea of certification, as well as community forest management, was to make the selective logging more sustainable, because it can still cause a huge degradation. It can basically ruin the forest. And so if the idea is that if you log the forest sustainably, if you don't take out too much, then the next generation and the next will still have trees to be able to extract. So this is about sustainable timber yield. How can we make the forest sustainable in economic terms? But that's not the only thing we have to worry about. Because tropical forests, they cover 2.4 billion hectares, which is huge. It's 4 Australias. And so they store a huge amount of carbon, 250 billion tons of carbon. At the same time, they're really important for biodiversity. It's estimated that as much as half of all terrestrial species live in tropical forests and nowhere else. And if that weren't enough, there are over 350 million people that are directly dependent for their survival on tropical forests. And so, in fact, in the recent study that we've done together with Panyuan, who's somewhere there in the middle, we have found over 30 different uses and expectations and values that people think tropical forests have and they can offer us, from biodiversity conservation, carbon sequestration, jobs, money, food, fuel, medicine, all the way to social capital. And so the idea is that tropical forest certification and community forest management, they try to manage the forest sustainably for all of these values. So now talking specifically about certification. There are many certification initiatives, but today I'll be mostly talking about the Forest Stewardship Council, because it's the most important one in the tropics. And the idea is that you, as a customer, if you buy these wooden and paper products, and if you care that they come from a forest that is managed sustainably, you'll be willing to pay a little extra, which is called a price premium on certified products. So the FSC, the Forest Stewardship Council, has produced this map of where their certified forests are in the world. The darker the green, the more certified areas. And this looks pretty good. I mean, there's a lot of dark green, a lot of coverage. But when we look at the actual numbers, there is almost 190 million hectares certified, which sounds like a big number, but actually worldwide that's less than 5% of forests. And in the tropics, it's just a tiny sliver. It's 1.2% of tropical forests are certified by the FSC. And as I mentioned earlier, FSC is the main certification standard in the tropics. And in fact, many people see this as the major failure of the FSC. It's been around for 25 years, but the reach is very limited. And later in the talk, we might be able to see why that is. So now talking specifically about community forest management. And I'm comparing that to no management, which is basically no rules about extraction activities. So this term, community forest management, it encompasses a lot of different other terms like community, joint management, co-management, but all of these schemes, they're very different, but they have one thing in common, which is some degree of decentralization of the power over the forest from the government, from the central government to the communities. They vary a lot in terms of, for example, how much power the community has. Sometimes the community has to accept a management plan that somebody in the government has designed and just implemented. Other times the community can decide what they want to do. It also differs in terms of whether the community can sell, whether they can be commercially active with the timber or whatever they source from the forest, or whether they can just use it for subsistence. Another important thing to keep in mind is that sometimes communities are just handed down a very degraded forest. This happens a lot in Africa. And they're just told, okay, manage this sustainably. Other times, there's a long tradition, like in Mexico and Guatemala, where communities have been managing the same forest for 100 years. But all of these, despite all this variation, there is an overarching theme, which is managing the forest sustainably in terms of environmental, social, and economic outputs that the forest has to offer. And this is in common with tropical forest certification. So now I want to talk a little bit about how we can evaluate what these two schemes do on the ground. And I want to look at that in terms of all of these different variables that we assign to tropical forests. There are a lot of difficulties. It's tricky. It's tricky to know whether something has really worked or not. And here are 7 of the most important pitfalls in evaluating, in fact, any conservation intervention, not just certification or community forest management. I won't describe all of these in details because you've come across them probably in other types of analyses, like confounding variables. But there are some that are specific to forestry or to certification. So for example, number 2, direct and indirect effects. That's quite interesting. So FSC puts a great emphasis on training the logging crew, training the workers. They train them in what's called reduced impact logging. And that means planning the harvest, extracting trees very carefully, minimizing the road network, and so on. And so these workers are trained, but then they can just quit the FSC company. They can go and move on to another company. And it's very unlikely that they will go back to their original practices. They won't just forget the training. And in fact, it's been shown in the literature that almost always they bring up the standard of the conventional company. And so this is a positive indirect effect, but there are also negative ones. Another interesting one is self-selection bias, number 3. And both forest certification and community forest management are voluntary. You as a forest manager can decide if you'll become certified or not. And so it's likely that the managers or communities that are already doing better, that are already managing their forest kind of well, will be more likely to decide to go for certification. So in fact, certification might not be improving the management, it might just be rewarding existing behavior, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it's something we need to keep in mind. So what I've done, I've gone through the literature to find all the studies that compare these management regimes, certified, uncertified, community managed, no management. And I came up with 50 studies that made these comparisons. And one study could contribute multiple comparisons. That's why we have here 318 comparisons overall, because one study can measure biodiversity as well as carbon, for example. Here is how the studies are distributed across the globe. South America is the highest density. And so, just to remind you, I've looked at 4 different comparisons. During this talk, I'll mostly be talking about this comparison, conventional industrial management with certified management, and community forest management with no management. I'll also briefly talk about what happens when community becomes certified. So to the first comparison of certified and conventional industrial management. Here is all the data that I have found. In this graphic, each square is one comparison. So green squares are comparisons where certified industry did better than the conventional one. Yellow squares mean that certification didn't bring any additional benefits. And red squares mean that actually certified forests were worse in some respect than the uncertified ones. So if we zoom in on economic variables, and here I've highlighted all the squares, which is all the comparisons that pertain to one specific variable, profitability. So you can see that there is 5 green squares, okay, profitability is a little better. You have 3 yellow squares, no difference, and then quite a few red squares, which means that profitability of certified forest was worse than of conventional management. And that might be because of the higher pre-logging costs in a certified operation. This means, as I've already mentioned before, a lot of effort goes into this reduced impact logging, into planning. So you have to map out every single tree, say what it is, what species it is, whether it will be logged or not. You have to plan really carefully all the roads and the skid trails, which is the little trails where you drag the tree down to a road. And this can take, for a little 100-hectare cutting block, it takes weeks of work for one logging crew. So this is expensive, but the costs of it don't seem to be made up for by the price premium, by the extra money we pay for certified products. It's interesting because here you can see actually the majority of squares, so the comparisons that pertain to price premium are green. But when we look in detail at them, the price premium that these companies obtained was really tiny. It was 1 or 2% extra, whereas the FSC initially proposed something between 15 and 25%. But here it's interesting to know the background story, because it's not actually, it doesn't seem that it would be the customers that are not willing to pay extra. It seems that the price premium gets lost somewhere across the supply chain. So there's the traders or sawmills or somewhere along those lines. So when we go back to the overview, it seems that certification is not altogether a profitable business. So the next important question is, do the benefits that we receive from certification in terms of environmental and social outcomes, do they make up for the potentially lost money? And when we look at environmental comparisons, the tally looks more optimistic. There are more green squares. For example, there is pretty consistent evidence that there is less ground disturbance in certified tropical forests. By ground disturbance, I mean the damage that happens to the ground, through roads, skid trails, fallen trees. And this is really important for both carbon and biodiversity, as well as erosion control. There's also quite some consistent evidence that animal diversity is higher in certified forests than in conventionally managed ones. And here I want to look in detail into one of these squares, partly because it's my own study, partly because biodiversity is my favorite topic, but mostly to illustrate the level of detail that goes into these individual squares. So in this one study, I looked at the abundance of individual bird species in certified concessions or in concessions that were logged with this reduced impact logging and compare them with concessions that were logged conventionally. I looked at with many different other variables like how long ago the forest was logged and so on. But I was able to get together information on almost 1,000 tropical species of birds, and I was able to pull together 4,400 comparisons of abundance. So I had data on how big a population of, let's say, a hornbill was in a logged forest, and compare that with how many individuals of that same species were in a comparable unlogged forest. And it did turn out that reduced impact logging decreased the negative effects that logging had on the species abundance or the population sizes. There were other variables that were important, like what the particular species eats, what's its diet, how big it is, and also how long has the population been recovering from selective logging. And in fact, another study by my colleague Jake Bicknell found the same pattern for mammals. So that's the second green square. But here there's something tricky that I want to talk about more. Both Jake in his study of mammals and me in my study of birds, we found that yes, reduced impact logging decreases the negative impact of logging on mammals and birds, but only once we have taken into account the logging intensity. By logging intensity, I mean how many trees per hectare were taken out. I want to talk about this a little more because I think it's important. So in another study, before all of these studies, I looked at the impact on selective logging on species richness. So that's different from abundance that I was mentioning earlier. This is how many species there are in the forest. I put together almost 50 studies that compared species richness of different taxonomic groups in logged forests and forests that hadn't been logged. Some of these studies looked at logging that was certified, others weren't certified. And when we plot all the responses from these studies on this graph, where the relative species richness in the logged forest is on the x-axis. So anything that's below 100% means that species richness after logging declined. Anything that's above 100% means species richness, there are more species in the logged forest than in the control or primary forest. On the y-axis is the number of studies. So you can see that a little bit more than half of studies show negative impact of selective logging on species richness. The other half shows that actually species richness increased. So here it's really important to know why that might be, because ideally we want just this. We don't want any declines in species richness. So for each study, I extracted several variables that I thought might explain this distribution of responses. Anything from which continent the study was done on, what type of forest, how long ago was the forest logged, and what taxonomic group we're talking about. And using the information theoretic approach, which lets me assess all the possible combinations of these variables and see how likely they are in explaining this distribution we have here, I was able to pick the most parsimonious or most likely model. And the most likely model was quite a simple one, that the species richness is explained by the logging intensity and taxonomic group. So here, the relative species richness is now on the y-axis. So again, 100% means no change. And on the x-axis, we have the logging intensity. So how many cubic meters of wood have we taken out? Which you can just think of as how many trees did we take out from each hectare. So when we look at invertebrates, you can see that the species richness slowly declines as we increase logging intensity. For amphibians, the decline is much steeper, and for mammals, it's even steeper. Now, when we look at birds, it's slightly less intuitive. Bird species richness seems to increase with logging intensity. And that's a little strange, but when we zoom into birds and separate them into forest specialists, like hornbills, on this graph with the red triangles, and habitat generalists with the black circles, that means species that don't really need forest for survival. We can see that as the total species richness increases beyond the original levels, this is actually mostly due to the increase in habitat generalists. In this, the forest specialists pretty much always decline. And I think this is really important. I've just shown that selective logging intensity is the most important variable in determining species richness. I also considered reduced impact logging, but it did not come out as the most important variable. Its effect, it doesn't mean that there is no effect. And in fact, we saw in the previous other studies that there is some subtle effect on abundance of species. But this is drowned by the strong effect of logging intensity. And this is important because there is nothing at all in the principles and criteria of the FSC about logging intensity. There's only an indirect way that logging companies have to regulate their logging intensity, and that's FSC obliges them to basically obey national standards. But those are outdated, and they're mostly only about sustainable timbering, not about biodiversity at all. And so this is really important to me, and I'm trying to talk to logging companies, both on the ground in tropical forests, as well as companies higher up the wood and paper supply chain. And I'm trying to explain to them, okay, logging intensity is really important. Reduced impact logging is also important, but we have to do both. I often use this graph because companies don't like real graphs. So this shows the same information as before. As we move from left to right, the logging intensity increases. And the three different colors for each types of animals show how many species will be losing. So let's say if a company will be logging at 50 cubic meters per hectare, I can tell them, okay, you'll be losing more than 50% of your mammal species. You'll be losing somewhere between 50 and 100% species of amphibians, and you will only be gaining habitat generalist bird species. So this is something that I think should be ultimately incorporated directly into the FSC standards, but it's kind of a long-term process to change those standards. So now going back, I want to show you one more environmental variable. And this is how much deforestation happens within the concessions, within certified forestry concessions and within the regular ones. There are only 4 studies. 2 of them show that there is less deforestation within certified concessions. 2 show that there's no difference. But all of these studies are just from one country, various case studies. What we really need is a global or pan-tropical study at least that will look at the real impacts of FSC on deforestation. Because in a sense, it's not that important whether one small farmer has cleared 1 hectare of forest in a certified concessions and 2 hectares in a conventional one. We really need to know whether FSC actually helps forest concessions withstand pressure from other industries, like oil palm or, let's say, the beef industry. Because what might be happening is that you get a concession, it becomes certified, but then the pressure from oil palm becomes so strong, and then the company just loses the certificate and becomes converted. We want to know whether certified companies are more likely to stay, or certified concessions rather, are more likely to stay as forests than ones that don't have certificates. Because in some sense, this is the fundamental variable. If there is no forest, all of these other variables, they don't make any sense at all. They will be irrelevant. Anyway, now I want to talk a little bit more about social variables. There's not that much data, but one of the really important aspects of FSC certification is to improve the working condition of the logging crews. Selective logging in the tropics is one of the most dangerous jobs around. It's really almost as bad as mining. There's usually really old equipment, no safety, almost no training. And so when we look at the comparisons that measure working conditions, we see quite an optimistic picture. There are 6 green squares, so 6 positive comparisons that somehow the working conditions improved. But here I want to point out that the baseline conditions in the tropics are just so bad that any little improvement, even if you just hand out a safety helmet, that will count as green here. So we have to be asking ourselves if that's good enough, if it's just better. One final comparison for the certified industry I want to mention is FSC hopes or promotes less conflict with local communities. For the FSC, indigenous communities are really important and they really push for this. But in this evidence mapping exercise, I didn't find really convincing evidence that there would be less conflict. In fact, sometimes there was more conflict. And that makes sense because what happens often is that companies that are not certified, they don't really care if a community does some small-scale activity within the concession. If they do a little bit of hunting, if they clear a little patch of forest and plant rice or potatoes, because the conventional company doesn't really lose that much. They've done their logging, they don't care. But a certified company is obliged by the FSC to enforce and prevent any illegal activities, any illegal hunting or clearing. And so effectively, the certified companies are taking on the role of the state, and that inevitably leads to more conflict with the local communities. So now I want to talk a little more about community forest management and how it compares with no management at all. I won't go into too much detail about this, partly because there's much less data to show, but I want to point out 2 important things. Number one is we see the data gap pattern is reversed. There's much more data on social comparisons and almost nothing on economic and environmental comparisons. And this is the opposite case from this comparison of industrial, of certification, where social sciences seem to be less popular. So this is something that we should address in future studies. The second thing is, when we do zoom into the social comparisons, the data, the comparisons are quite controversial. There seem to be more conflict, for example, and this is similar reasons or similar sort of trade-off with the certification. The more participation and awareness there is, and there does seem to be more when you push for community forest management, the more conflict there is, because there are more voices, more people discussing how should we best manage our forests. Everybody has a different opinion. Most of these comparisons are about whether community forest management brings more resources or not to the community. And it seems to be pretty much evenly divided. Some studies show that yes, there are more resources available. Others show that there are even fewer resources than before community forest management. And this depends really on the question, resources for whom within the community. And other comparisons have shown that there is less equality in community managed forests. And this is an unfortunate trade-off that I have come across again and again in this literature review. The poor, unfortunately, seem to become even poorer in community managed forests. And this makes sense, because if you think about it, the poorest people in any community are the ones that are most dependent on the forest resources. They'll be the ones that will be hunting for food, that really need the fuel wood from the forest, and so on. And so when you put any regulations at all on using the resources from the forest, the poor will be the ones that are most hard hit. So the question we need to be able to answer is whether in the long run the poor will benefit or whether they will just stay marginalized. There are a few other trade-offs that I came across consistently. I want to mention a spatial trade-off. So we have found both in certified forests and community managed forests that sometimes when they are able to hold their forest cover better, there's less deforestation happening within the certified or community managed forests. When you look at the neighboring concessions or neighboring areas of land, deforestation is actually going up. So if you think about this, if you're a farmer and suddenly you're not allowed to clear a patch of forest and plant rice in this forest, you will just go to the next one if there's no other solution. So this again highlights the importance of considering the whole region, or at least whole area, and not just paired certified or community managed forest with ones with no management. The final trade-off I would like to mention is about this one red square in the economic comparisons, because I think this is important, especially when we're talking about certified communities. So this is a new set of comparisons of normal community forest management with certified community forest management. There's not too much data, but what is interesting is this one red square, because I think it influences a lot of the other comparisons. What we find that a lot of NGOs push for communities to get certified. And one of the ways to advertise this to communities, they say, oh, you know, if you become certified, you will be able to sell your products, your wood, at international environmentally aware markets. You will be able to get this price premium. But what happens a lot, it seems, is that the communities are just too small to produce enough wood to be able to access the international markets. They're not able to guarantee a steady flow of, 500 cubic meters of wood every year. Because they're so small, the logging, it's just not so reliable. So often what happens is they're not able to sell at international markets, and then there are very few local markets for wood that would be environmentally aware and that would care to pay extra for certified wood. So the communities often just undersell their wood for even less money because maybe they missed the initial window of selling. So I think I have probably showed you enough of the complexities, of the data gaps, of the details that go behind all of these comparisons. I've probably shown you that it's really complicated, shown you a lot of different trade-offs, not all of these. I want to conclude with zooming out a little bit. And I think it's important because there's a lot of support for certification and for community forest management. So I want to be able to say, okay, should we, as a community of environmentalists and conservation practitioners, should we push for certification and community forest management? So first of all, industrial certification. It's been around for 25 years. The reach is limited, the picture is not entirely rosy, there are some negative impacts. Yet, I would say a resounding yes to industrial certification. This is because I think that forest industry is becoming increasingly globalized, similar to all other industries. And in industry, I think we need standards. We need to, it all gets so, one product that you buy comes from 3 different forests, so it's really difficult to trace individually where everything comes from. So I think bringing up the standard in industry is important. And the FSC at least nudges the companies into the right direction of corporate responsibility and sustainable forest management. I think it's important, though, to try to improve the uptake by ensuring that the price premium gets all the way down to the forest management units. And I also think that the certification standards, these principles and criteria that the FSC has, have to become a little more dynamic because much more evidence is available now. So we need to be able to change the practices and the standards according to that evidence. And for example, incorporate logging intensity. Now, community forest management. I don't think there's enough data to say yes or no. But for the moment, I think most of the negative impacts we have seen are some sort of growing pains. So I am personally enthusiastic about community forest management because I think that it has a lot of potential, and especially in the communities that have been managing their forests for 100 years, we see positive impacts. I would say no, though, to certification to communities as a blanket measure. I think communities, they're already really heterogeneous within themselves. You know, a community is not one lump of people. There are men, women, unemployed, rich, poor. And so I think we really have to abandon this idea that one measure fits all, because there's also a huge difference, obviously, between communities across the world. And so I would personally push for really highly tailored solutions that take into account where the community is, how big it is, what is their experience with managing the forest, and what sort of support they can get. And I think the idea of this coupling, let's say, of New York City with this one forest in Washington is a good example of this really tailored solution. And so I want to conclude by saying that I think there is a lot of appetite for managing forests sustainably in the industry, in NGOs, as well as in academia. I mean, the Sustainable Development Goals, almost all of them feature forests in some way or another. So I think it's really important, if we push for sustainable forest management, to look at the evidence and do this right. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Zuzana. Could get the lights up and we'll take questions from the audience. Zuzana, I'll let you pick your own questions.
Just a quick clarification question. You showed that I think the number was 1.2% of tropical forests are certified. Is that of all tropical forests or of the ones that are under some sort of logging?
That's of all tropical forests.
And so do you have some idea, is that
Out of the
10% or 50% of the ones that are logged?
I think it's somewhere between 5 and 7% of the logged. But it's I'll look into that more. That's interesting.
Zuzana, I want to ask a question, which is, you flagged the intensity of logging as something that has an impact essentially above and beyond current certification standards. When you raise the idea of somehow accounting for logging intensity, what has been the response of people involved in certification programs?
Well, the direct response from FSC was, oh, that's wonderful research. Yes, that was really relevant and interesting. But if we propose a change, we have to go through the lower chamber, upper chamber. This is an extremely complex process of making any tiny change to the principles and criteria. So the response was generally positive, but also saying this is not going to happen.
And then, does that then raise the possibility that a lot of this certification will be akin to the old joke, other than that, how did you like the play, Mrs. Lincoln, where they get a certification badge, but in fact, because of the intensity of logging, a tremendous amount of damage has been done that isn't, in this sense, isn't punished by or accounted for by the certifications.
I think that would have been my main worry, let's say, back in the 70s, when there was still a lot of timber stock in the forest. But, for fortunately as well as unfortunately now, most of the forests around the world, especially in Southeast Asia and South America, are already being logged. They're on their second, third, and sometimes even fourth logging cycle. And because they've been logged unsustainably fast, the amount of timber that they can get out is actually often less than the allowable cutting limit. So in the forest that have been logged multiple times, this might be less issue for the moment. But I think this is really important in new forests that have been newly allocated as a logging concession. For example, in the Democratic Republic of Congo or Papua New Guinea, I think this is really somewhere where we have to focus and push for this.
I have a couple of questions. So you convinced me with the need for tailored solutions when it comes to community community managed forests. I was wondering if you think it's really useful to have, if not necessarily a certification, some sort of, not even guidance, but list of priorities for them to maybe even come with their own management strategy, but make sure they cover certain type of aspects of conservation, engagement, across minorities within their own community, but also across needs. And the second question was mainly, there's more details perhaps, but when you mentioned that these communities tend to be pretty small and don't produce enough to access the international market, are they sparse enough that it would not be possible to aggregate the output from multiple communities and use and funnel that into the international market?
Mm-hmm. I'll answer the second question first because that's the one I remember right now. So this is this pooling of or grouping communities together to be able to access international markets has been happening a little bit in South America, especially in Mexico. And there's actually one study that's happening right now that's looking at whether this will bring economic benefits. I think all of them were FSC certified. And I think that might work probably if the communities produce the same species of tree. Because also it's hard to market. If you have 10 different species, each will be maybe lower quantity. And then the first question, whether or not there should be some recommendations, but not certification. I think that pretty much exists because a lot of the time it's either the government that pushes for this decentralization or community forest management or individual NGOs. And the NGOs have some experience from other communities. So I think they're often able to give the priorities and give these ideas. But what comes up a lot is that the NGOs that push for certification in communities, they do it most, or often it seems, because that's something to show to donors. A logo, oh, we have certified this community. And they can show, I don't know, a Rainforest Alliance logo. But then often the communities get really high expectations and are then disappointed. So I would say yes to kind of generic recommendations, but maybe there is no need to draft the global recommendations of priorities for communities, because I think that's kind of happening. Yeah, Mike?
I hear what you said about the FSC, and I wonder if there are any certification strategies that allow for updating with new evidence, and is there that sort of thing, or is there any possibility for that to happen?
Well, I would say that, at least in the tropics, the FSC has the strictest standards. So I don't really know whether the less strict standards of the other certification schemes mean that they would be more easily updated, but I rather doubt it.
I wonder if you come up with with the change in scientific evidence on things, is there a possibility of the FSC also updating with that, or once you get the certification, you're bound by it, and there's very little chance of that changing in future?
You mean like for an individual company, if I received a certificate? Right. So what happens every time you receive an FSC certificate, it's for 5 years. It's valid for 5 years. And every 5 years you have a major audit where usually an international auditor comes and looks at the forest usually only at the parts that you take them to. And then every year they have kind of a smaller audit or assessment. But so every 5 years they can potentially lose their certificate. So then if the standards change in year 4, they will have to comply with the new standards after 5 years. And we're trying to come up with colleagues from the Rainforest Alliance and WWF. We're trying to come up with a new way that the auditors would have to collect data on the ground and report them to some global database, where the FSC itself would see the evidence more clearly. But so it's a long shot.
It's interesting, I've done a lot more thinking about sustainable fishery certification, and one of
Fishery certification.
this is just sustainable fishery certification in general, and so it was very interesting to hear about forest certification in relation to fishery certification. And I think in fisheries, one of the big contests is that there's a lot of conflict about which fisheries are certified and the methods that are used to certify them. And one thing that I thought was interesting, which sort of speaks a little bit to the previous question, is that you were looking at the FSC certification and not whether you thought the FSC certification is a valid certification or a valid process. And I'm curious about whether you think the FSC is a valid process, if you have suggestions for changing it or improving it, or if that is even a conversation within the field in a way that it sort of appears to be on the fisheries side.
So you're asking about whether within the other certification bodies, FSC is the right one, or whether that debate exists?
Yeah, and well, as somebody who has now a lot of experience here, whether what you think of the FSC certification process in particular.
Well, I have to say, at least it's the most rigorous one in the tropics. Although I should say that the situation is quite a bit different in boreal and temperate forests. And that debate between FSC and PFC is much, which certification standard is better, is much stronger and lively in North America and Europe and Russia. But in the tropics, it's not so much. It's usually the debate between, if a forest manager is deciding, they would either go for FSC or for some sort of national certification, which is usually easier and cheaper, but then less recognized internationally. I personally think that the certification process of FSC could be good if it was less rigid. Because it seems to me that the FSC, in almost 3 decades it's been existing, and it's grown into this really, really rigid machine that just cannot change at all. So I don't know whether it's possible to change that or whether it would be better to have a completely new thing. But I am personally more for improving on what we already have been starting from zero.
Thanks for the talk. I thought it was fascinating. I have a question about the economic side. You said there were some studies that showed that there was potentially less profitability from the forest. I was wondering if there was potential for that to be offset by other income streams like carbon offsets or tourism or something like that.
Yep. So carbon offsets I think that would be a great option if certified forests could receive, for example, funding from RAD or RAD Plus. But there are 2 problems with that. One is that multiple studies have shown that reduced impact logging compared to conventional one does cause more carbon to be stored in the forest, but by a really, really, really tiny percentage. And so then the question would be, okay, is the baseline the conventional logging, or is the baseline no forest? If the baseline is no forest, then yeah, FSC certified forests can get quite a lot of money from RED Plus, let's say. If the baseline is conventional forest, they will get $5 a hectare. And the other problem is the way RED Plus worked last time I looked at it. It wasn't possible to log forest and get credits for that. As far as tourism, okay, when I was in these logging concessions in Indonesia, I thought it would be just the best mountain biking terrain. The there's so many steep roads up and down, but I thought that would be great, but I don't think that's going to happen just because usually the logging companies are already very scared about anybody entering their property. And there's often a lot of safety hazards, trees falling and landslides happening. So I think that would be great for forests that are maybe retired from logging, but are still part of the logging concession. Forests where we know, okay, in 35 years there's not going to be any trees we can extract, but we're still keeping this. Maybe somehow tourism would be good, because it is a good point that when you go across the logging road, you see many more animals than if you're in the thick rainforest, just because the animals cross the road. So it's a good idea.
Any other questions? Yes.
I thought it was also very interesting this changes in conflict with communities, between government companies. I was wondering to what degree, if you could describe to what degree members of the communities are engaged in ongoing discussions through the planning process with government, or is it a very top-down approach where they just tell the community what to do, and I can see that being very problematic.
So there's it's a bit of both. So some communities are allowed to actually design their own management programs, and they might even have somebody from the government come in and help them out. Other times they're just told, okay, you will be extracting this much wood for the next 10 years, and no hunting is allowed. And then there is a lot of conflict. But it does seem that what happens often is that there are certain parts of the community that are more proactive, and that want to participate and want to manage the forest, but then not necessarily include everybody else, which is normal, And also not everybody wants to be managing forests. Some people want to do something else, like beekeeping or something. And so I would say that there is examples of everything across the world.
Well, Zuzana, thank you so much for a truly superb talk.